Good afternoon. My name is Dayna Bowen-Matthew. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm delighted to welcome you to GW Law for the Brand-Manatt Lecture. This is one of the signature events of our school year. It's a wonderful day in the life of the school, and I want to begin by thanking the people that made it possible. First, I want to thank Manatt and Brand families for establishing this flagship lecture. We're extremely proud and truly blessed to count the late Joe Brand and the late Ambassador Charles Manatt among our distinguished alumni. I'm also delighted to thank my dear friends, Wes and Barbara Brand-Manatt, who generously endowed the Deanship in International and Comparative Law, and they are here with us today. So if you'll just join me in thanking our alumni for these wonderful, wonderful programs that we're able to bring to you. The Brand-Manatt Lecture is an endowed series that was established in 2016 to bring leading public figures and scholars to the law school to discuss pressing issues in international law. Mr. Brand, who graduated from our law school in 1963, was a partner in the law firm of Squire Patton Boggs and a trustee of the George Washington University. Ambassador Manatt, who graduated from our law school in '62, was the founder of Manatt, Phelps, and Phillips, the UN ambassador, the United States ambassador to the Dominican Republic, and chair of the Democratic National Committee. Yeah, I heard that giggle. That's okay. It's an election year. We're ready here. While both Mr. Brand and Mr. Manatt have sadly passed on, their spirit and devotion to this law school, along with their positive impact on the GW Law community, certainly does live on through the Brand-Manatt Lecture. I want to also extend a very, very warm welcome to our Brand-Manatt lecturer, Dr. Anne Marie Slaughter, CEO of the New America, a think tank and action tank, not just a think tank, but also an action tank dedicated to renewing the promise and ideals of the United States, who will address us today on the topic, Politics for People and Planet, a New Paradigm. So a word about our distinguished speaker. She's an international lawyer, a foreign policy analyst, and the former dean and professor emerita of Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs. I cannot think of a more perfect lecturer to address the current state of the world, the current state of world affairs, and strategies for confronting ongoing global challenges. Many thanks to you, Dr. Slaughter, for joining us today. We look forward with great anticipation to your lecture, and we're thrilled to have you here at GW Law. Today's program is a shining example of GW Law's important role as a leader in advancing the use and enforcement of international law and addressing the pressing issues of our time. We've all been closely following a variety of critical issues around the globe, from challenges to democracy in upcoming elections, to ongoing human rights violations, and the perils of climate change, the dangers of artificial intelligence, and cyber attacks as well. Through events like this one, GW Law demonstrates its deep commitment to the fields of international and comparative law and its ability to convene critical actors, thinkers, and leaders in the pursuit of dignity, social justice, and human rights throughout the world. And after all, that is what higher education brings to the world. I believe we bring hope and we nurture the hopes of the world through events like these. Before turning the podium over to my colleague, Sean Murphy, the Manatt Professor of International Law, who will formally introduce our Brand-Manatt lecturer, I would like to take one more moment of your time to thank a few key people who have made this outstanding program possible. So Sean Murphy, of course, thank you for making this lecture possible. Dean Rosa Solario, who's the Brand-Manatt Family Associate Dean and Distinguished Lecturer of International and Comparative and Legal Studies. I want you guys to know that I'm exercising enormous discipline, not to tell you about their articles, their convenings, all of their accomplishments, but just to recognize all the hard work that you both have done to make this possible. Leah Calabrio, who's a visiting professor and fellow for the International and Comparative Law program, and Yenzi Dai, who is the program associate for International and Comparative Law. Many thanks also to Deb Gales, who made it possible with her events team for us to have refreshments and everything that she did to make this day special. And finally, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to our co-sponsors. They are the American Society of International Law, the International Law section of the American Bar Association, and GW's International Law Society. So now it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Sean Murphy to the podium to formally introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, for those opening remarks. And I'm afraid that Dr. Slaughter has to suffer through a little bit more of an introduction, just because we do like to celebrate the careers of those that we bring to the law school, particularly for students. It's interesting to see the different paths that our speakers take. So I'll start out with the fact that Dr. Slaughter graduated from Princeton College and received her law degree at Harvard Law School, and then also received her master's and PhD at the University of Oxford. She began her academic career on the faculty at the University of Chicago Law School, where she was, I believe, from 1989 to 1994. And then she went to be on the faculty at Harvard Law School as the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International, Foreign, and Comparative Law. Now, for most people, that would be the height of their career. They'd be done. But in Dr. Slaughter's case, she decided to move on from that. Now, while she was at Harvard, she was the president of the American Society of International Law for 2 years, so I'm honored to be a successor of hers in that position. But she moved from Harvard down to Princeton University, where from 2002 to 2009, she was the dean of the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, which was an interesting transition from focusing on law to international relations. And indeed, much of her career has been, spanning these domains. In 2009, during the first term of President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton appointed Dr. Slaughter as the first woman director of policy planning in the U.S. Department of State. She's written and lectured widely on global network design and leadership, on gender equality and elevating the value of care for both men and women, and on American renewal. Indeed, she's the author or editor of 9 books, including my favorite, A New World Order. I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful assessment of the emergence of and importance of networks operating in the field of international law. She's a contributing editor at the Financial Times, a regular columnist for Project Syndicate. She's probably most widely known among the public for her 2012 article in the Atlantic magazine entitled "Why Women Still Can't Have It All," which prompted a very robust national debate about the difficulties women face in pursuing a career and family. Currently, Dr. Slaughter is, as the dean said, Chief Executive Officer of New America, a think tank based here in Washington, D.C. As such, she is a global leader, scholar, and public intellectual, and we are so very lucky to have her as our Brand-Manatt Lecturer this year. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Slaughter.
Thank you. I am well introduced. And I'm delighted to be here. I just strolled down H Street. New America is H and 15th. So it was lovely to come down. And really, I feel back home. Laura Dickinson and Paul Berman are old friends. Sean is an old friend and colleague. And yes, the first part of my career was spent as an international lawyer. What Sean didn't say is that I actually never expected to be an academic. I expected to be a practicing lawyer at a big New York firm. I never thought about Washington in those days, but I certainly would now. And I was going to go in and out of the State Department. And along the way, I got the academic bug, and it was wonderful being an international lawyer. With all of that, however, my lecture today is not going to have a lot of law in it, although I will close with a set of reflections on what the politics that I'm going to describe and the problem-solving techniques I'm going to describe mean for where I think law is going. And one of the great things about being a legal scholar, and indeed a practitioner, is law is a very plastic discipline. Right? It allows you to pursue philosophy or economics or history, and now medicine and biology, because law reflects, who we are, who we're becoming, whom we aspire to be, and is constantly informed by all those other disciplines, and at the same time shapes them. It's that dual quality of creating the framework within which our politics take place, but our politics also constantly inform it. I was yesterday at a talk at Columbia by Ruchi Teitel, who's a law professor of international humanitarian law, and it was a political science seminar, so of course all the questions were about, well, why did this happen, and how do you prove it, and all the questions that political scientists ask, which are very important questions. I'm married to one, a political scientist. We have many of these debates, but I finally had to say, look, this is a law paper. This is exactly a paper where, yes, it's important why these things happen, but it's really important that these things are happening and that she is able to place them in a context, in this case of transitional justice. So that's the spirit in which I am going to talk about global politics for people and planet. And I'm going to try to describe what I think is an emerging paradigm of how we can think in global terms. And it's not just global, it's global terms centered on people and planet, and how that paradigm coexists with the state-based paradigm of classic international law that those of you who've studied international law are well trained in and taught by here. Let me back up and start with the state-based paradigm. In all of this, we speak in grand, sweeping terms. And if you are taking an international relations course or you start an international law course, you essentially are told that in 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, the modern nation-state system sprung from the forehead, or it wouldn't have been Zeus, but whatever, or Athena, that you had a fully fledged nation-state system, and you had a body of international law, international between states, that regulated that law. Now that is, of course, nonsense. You did have a very messy system. If you actually look at a map of Europe, say 1630, it looks a little like the internet today. It's all sorts of principalities and duchies and religious territories, and it's all mixed up. And then, of course, you have the 30 Years' War, and you have the Peace of Westphalia, which is a couple of treaties. And then it takes a good 2 centuries before you get anything like what we think of as the body of international law today. And that process of that law being shaped continues through the 19th century. And by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, you get the beginnings of a parallel body of both politics and law. So these things are evolving together, where, yes, nation states and international organizations are the subjects and objects of international law, but at the same time, people are starting to think, well, what about people? So you can go back to the early arbitration treaties and the early humanitarian law. That's late 19th century into the teens, into the 20s. And then, of course, with first with the globalization of colonialism, and then the globalization caused by 2 world wars. The globalization caused those wars, but those wars also contributed. By the mid-20th century, you obviously have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, so you're really starting to see there. At the same time, you have the International Court of Justice and the UN and what we know now to be the liberal international order, or the rules-based international order, which I actually think is a better way to describe it. just as we're creating all those things in the 1940s, so are we also laying those foundations for international human rights law. We're building on international humanitarian law. And then, I'm fast forwarding very quickly, but by the time Sean and I are studying international law in the 1980s and 1990s, you're starting to see international criminal law, which when I was in law school, that was that was Nuremberg, and maybe a little bit about the Armenians, but you're starting to see a whole body of international criminal law, and of course, international human rights law is its own course, environmental law. And I would say, if you look back, what you're seeing is the emergence of politics where people are the subject, and people and how they relate to their own government, but also then one level up. So again, these paradigms take a long time to crystallize. I would say that the state-based paradigm and the international institutions that are based on states is well crystallized. In the 1950s, you start getting transnational law. And I actually went back to look this up for this lecture because having been on the Harvard faculty, I would hear about this a lot. The case book on transnational law was Detlev Watts and then, later Harold Koh. But Philip Jessup coins the phrase transnational law in the Storrs lectures at Yale in the late 50s, and the book is actually published in 1956. And he says he's launching an assault on the barriers of classification and distinctions separating legal disciplines. I don't know how many articles I've written that sort of started with that same premise, but it's an evergreen. And he says transnational law includes all law that regulates actions and events that transcend national borders. Well, in a globalized era, that's not everything, but a huge amount, obviously, of what we do. And he's seeing that in 1956. And we still, many in the State Department, much of what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll talk to you about why, is still under the category of transnational law rather than global law. So I'm less interested ultimately in the labels, and there are many different categories and labels that try to capture this phenomenon. The way I think about it is in a book that I published in 2017, I call it the chessboard world and the web world. And there, the chessboard is the world of international politics. It's obviously, Henry Kissinger suggested that the United States plays chess and the Chinese play Go. There's also lots of poker games that we talk about chicken or prisoner's dilemma. But point being, that is a world that is alive and well of states where essentially global politics or international politics is a game of interstate strategy, where you're thinking about what move you make and what move the other state will make. Obviously, where we've got Russia invading Ukraine, you have China, you have Iran, that world is alive and well. But next to it is the web world. And the best way to understand this is think about a globe or a map. And it's all those brightly colored little squares. And depending on when you're born, you think they're permanent. You think the ones that you see are the ones that will always be there. As you get older, you realize states have emerged and disappeared over my lifetime. And of course, you then realize, of course, that continues to happen. But we still put them in multicolored squares, and that's how we think of the international system. That's our mental map. The web world is a world of light at night. So think about just the pictures you've seen. You can't see any national borders, but if you look at the world at night, you will see the east coast of the United States is ribbons, dense ribbons of light. And I live in New Jersey, and when you drive from New Jersey into New York in sort of that part of northern New Jersey, it's nothing but connected buildings, institutions, just one solid mass. Similarly, on the West Coast, in Europe, you'll also see the parts of the world that are more disconnected. So every country has rural areas, But if you look at Africa, for instance, or Latin America, you're looking at pretty narrow slices of connection down the coast and a vast area that is disconnected. That's the world of the web. That's the world of global networks. The internet is the most obvious example, but networks of all kinds. The book I wrote in 2004, A New World Order, talked about networks of government officials. Now you can think of networks of criminals, of course, arms, drugs, manufacturers, money launderers, but also civic networks, government networks, and massive corporate networks. So that I prefer to think about it for global politics terms as the chessboard and the web, and to say those two things coexist and they interact in all sorts of ways. So there's no claim here that the state is disappearing. Sean and I will remember in the 1990s, there were various claims of new medievalism. That's not going to happen. So what I want to do now is talk about the problems that arise in that web world, in that world of networks and global politics, where governments play an important role, but you are looking at non-state actors. I'd love to have a better term. One of my colleagues at NYU said that calling an NGO a non-state actor is like calling an automobile a horseless carriage. You are defining it by what it's not, but it's very hard to think of another category. But I want to talk about the problems that are arising in that arena where all those actors work, and increasingly that's engaging the planet. Then I want to talk about a number of the solutions and how many of those solutions talk about being people-centered or planet-centered. I didn't choose this language. I didn't make it up. It's in the zeitgeist. And then I will talk about some of the tools you can use, and then we'll come back to law. And you'll have a chance to ask some questions. All right, so thinking about how to describe problems. So I first went to Secretary General Guterres's Common Agenda in 2021, where he put out our common agenda, meaning the world's, certainly the United Nations. He was preparing then for the Summit of the Future, which will happen after the UN General Assembly this year. So it's a very important moment. And he says, here are the problems. And of course, this is during the pandemic. So he starts with the need for global solidarity, a global vaccination plan. And we did not have a global vaccination plan. The WHO tried in various ways, but China had its plan, the G7, the G20 had its plan. He's saying, no, what matters here is not geopolitical competition, it's the people. And for that, we should have a plan for everyone. So he starts with that. And then he talks about needing bold steps to address the triple crisis of climate disruption, biodiversity, and pollution. And those are only three of many. But again, those are issues that they affect states, but they affect people and the planet very directly. He talks about a new social contract based on human rights between governments and their people. I guarantee you that's impossible to imagine a Secretary General of the UN in 1945, 55, 65, pretty much till you get to Kofi Annan. But that's how he's describing the problems he sees. Then he says the infodemic, and again, of course, disinformation. Yes, states absolutely do it, but lots and lots of global actors do it. And then finally, and I find this very interesting, he talks about how we don't know how to measure economic progress properly. And that's because we measure economic progress in terms of states. We look at GDP, we look at unemployment, we look at these big aggregate measures. And he's saying we need measures of economic progress that actually capture the well-being and flourishing of human beings. So there you have the Secretary General describing a bunch of problems. Now, today, obviously, he would also talk about the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, but it would be a both and in terms of how he thinks about those problems. So then I'm going to move from there to, well, the State Department's there and the White House is down the road, but to the national security strategy. So here you'd think, okay, well, that's the Secretary General, he thinks globally, This is the Biden National Security Strategy, which was released in 2022 in October. It was supposed to come out in February, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, so they delayed it. And I can promise you they upped the emphasis and, of course, altered it on geopolitics. But it starts by saying we affect, hold on here. It starts by saying we face two sets of strategic challenges. And the first is geopolitical competition. It's the return of great power competition. So obviously, Russia, China, Iran all get mentions there. And Biden defines that more in terms of the democracies versus the autocracies. And that's something that he has done, and we could debate whether that's the right way to divide it. But it's entirely state-based. And he says that's a critical set of strategic challenges. And then he says, this is the national security strategy talking, he says people all over the world are struggling to cope with the effects of shared challenges that cross borders. So that's transnational in the White House language. And he lists climate change, of course, food insecurity, communicable diseases. I don't think we'd get any surprise there, terrorism, energy shortages, and inflation. Just a little odd in 2022. I would not include inflation as a global challenge in that way. But so that's the national security strategy, and the key thing is that it goes on to say that these transnational challenges, these shared challenges of climate, food security, energy, are just as existential as the geopolitical ones. That's actually historic for the United States to recognize that in its national security strategy. That it really, he says, they are every bit, or the White House says, they are every bit as important as those geopolitical challenges. So the war in Ukraine, huge. But climate change, communicable diseases, food insecurity, equally important. That to me was a little more surprising, and I think really does give you a sense of more, the salience of these issues. So then I want to just talk about two other ways of discussing these global problems or problems centered on people and planet. One is a book that is just out, well, actually it's out in April, so you're getting, it's by Thomas Hale, who's not a lawyer, he's a political scientist at the Brand-Manatt School in Oxford, and it's a book called Long Problems. And he says, long problems are problems whose causes and effects span the length of more than one human generation. So obviously climate change is his premier example. It's been in the making for generations and generations, and no matter what we do now, if tomorrow we could cut all our emissions to net zero, the consequences for acidification, for our climate, would expand for many years. I mean, the lifespan of carbon is infinitely longer than human generations. But he says it isn't just climate. Again, if you look at where viruses come from and the sort of underlying problems of human-animal interaction, that again takes it takes generations to create and will go on for generations. And he says the expansion of problems across the length of time is as important a change as the expansion of problems across space. So if you think of interstate to transnational to global and how we have to think about that, he says we need equally now to start thinking about how do we govern these problems that were generations in the making and will happen generations to come. And the problems of doing things about them, we can see with climate change. You need early action, but they're slow, and so there's not good knowledge about them. There's uncertainty often. It took us a long time to figure out exactly what was happening with climate change. There are all sorts of institutional lags, and there's lots of obstructionism. It's always easier to deal with the urgent problem than the long one. So long problems, these tend to be problems, again, that are focused on people and planet. Because state-based problems, there are, of course, governments that last longer than the human generation, but not many. And generally, those issues, certainly conflicts, are resolved, or economic crises. And finally, and this is also quite recent, this comes out of the Bear Gruen Institute, a focus on planetary problems. Now you say, okay, planetary problems, global problems, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that these are processes and conditions that span the Earth and that actually think of human beings as just one component in planetary systems. So obviously all other life is hugely important, but so too are all the ways, if we were studying the planet, the way we would think about the forces that shape the planet. So, and the claim there is that planetary problems are a specific category and need to be governed a specific way. So we have traditional international problems, we have transnational or global problems. You can choose your label. Again, I prefer problems that are people or planet-centered. You have long problems, you have planetary problems. So those are just different ways of coming at this category of problems, again, alongside geopolitical. Okay. Oh, actually, there's one last category. Hold on a second. Another way, I should say, of thinking about these problems are the Sustainable Development Goals, which again, that's really striking that you had the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs. That would not have happened in 1970 or 80 or 90. You really needed to be thinking globally about people to launch those. And down the street at the School of Advanced International Studies, Frank Gavin has a new book. It's an Adelphi paper that's out that is called Problems of Scarcity and Plenty. And he would say a lot of these problems we're identifying are problems of abundance. They're problems of having too much, and in that destroying our natural environment, but also thinking about migration and other human problems. So let's shift to solutions. I don't have any magical ones, but I have some. And here I want to actually talk about three different areas. I want to talk about conflict and trade and climate. Because what is striking in all three of those areas, and they're very different, is a call for people-centered solutions. People-centered security, people-centered trade, and people-centered environmental policy. I don't think people-centered environmental policy is so surprising, but I can tell you I was surprised to see people-centered trade. And I'm working on this stuff, and I still, really? As a student of John Jackson and many others, but I will talk through what that means and how it's being advanced. But start with conflicts. So the Uppsala Conflict Data Program actually says the number and intensity and length of conflicts worldwide is higher now than it's been at any time since the end of the Cold War. There are 55 active conflicts there were in 2022, each lasting about 8 to 11 years, which is a long time. That was up substantially from the last time they had looked at it, and I think it was 2019. Now, why? Well, again, we know this. I mean, this started in the 1990s, but it's gotten much worse. These conflicts are not interstate. Some of them are, but most of them are with armed groups of different kinds. So if you look at Mali or Chad or part of northern Nigeria, these are with religious groups. These are, you can call them terrorist groups, but they're more, splits in many countries. But what's critical, and you see this with the Wagner group in Ukraine, is these are, you can call them mercenaries, you can call them insurgents. They have access to the kind of weapons that only states used to have in terms of shoulder-fired missiles, and so they can carry on a conflict for 8 to 11 years. So how are you going to try to grapple with those conflicts? I mean, you can send in peacekeepers. Effectively, all you're doing is kind of managing the conflict. When you can even get the political will to pass a resolution to get the peacekeepers in there. So now you talk about peace builders and peace enforcers, but let's talk about peace builders. Peace builders are absolutely focused on identifying the drivers of conflict. Now we're well into a society. We are not looking at international law. We're looking at all sorts of grievances of different kinds. They are often related to climate change. I mean, in Darfur, it's the oldest conflict in the world, which is my land's no good, so I think I'll take yours. And never in human history has the group said, come on in, including certainly the United States. So the issue then is, and it's called people-centered security, is how do you actually put people on the ground who are well-trained in conflict mediation, but also in helping to build the institutions at ground level that will then help empower local leaders. So this is not, I mean, it's a version of state building, but it's the sort of more recent version. And the claim is that you need to work with non-traditional actors. Some of these, interestingly, this is where international or state-based and people-based intersects. You need to work with middle powers. So you get the big states out of there and you work with, often they can be regional powers, often they can be Nordic states, but also humanitarian workers, that won't surprise you, and corporations. That surprised me. Now some of that is because the corporations can be mining or exploiting whatever the national resource is, but some of that may also be that's the only way you're going to be able to create jobs in the region. So people-centered security is inclusive political dialogue, transitional justice, security sector reform, and working with all these different actors on the ground. There's a wonderful book called States of Disorder by Adam Day, who was a peacekeeper in Sudan and Congo for 10 years and really saw things up close. And he uses complexity theory to try to map these kinds of conflicts and how they intersect and how then conflict emerges and how to create more positive feedback loops. So it's really cutting edge work from the point of view of using complexity science. Again, it's deeply people-centered and often environmental as well. Okay, so that's conflict. Trade. So people-centered trade. Well, first, you have to, there's a framework called the Villars framework, where a number of international legal scholars I know, Joel Trackman and others, have been working effectively to figure out how they can make the WTO relevant again. That is not what they would say, but that's, I think, quite clear if you are a traditional trade lawyer. And I mean, I wasn't ever a trade lawyer, but I felt that the WTO, you know, with the establishment in the 1990s and the dispute resolution system, this was really, international law was working. And it was exciting to see. And it has been sidelined, and by the US as much as by other countries. Essentially, we lost too many cases. And even Democratic administrations decided to hold things up. So the issue now is, you know, trade hasn't gone away. Far from it, but it's this absolute congeries of different kinds of plurilateral, bilateral, regional trading frameworks. So how do you once again bring this within a global framework? And the solution is that you need a more sustainable, wait for it, people-centered, effective, inclusive, just, transparent, and global trading system. That's a lot of nice words. But really, the key to this is that it's a claim that the WTO is locked in the paradigm of reducing barriers to trade. And the goal there is that you essentially lower barriers to trade, and there'll be all sorts of externalities on jobs, on the environment, on labor standards, and you try to address those externalities. The new framework is that actually sustainable development is the goal. Now again, that's totally people-centered. You're now in the world of development. We're looking at how people develop and sustainably in ways that are consistent with the planet. And how can trade help you achieve that goal? So that's an enormous paradigm shift in the way we think about what trade is. It's very far from the GATT. It's far from all of 20th century trade law. And then when you look at the measurements, it's all about well-being. Worker well-being, consumer well-being, measuring that as measures of sustainable development. And then finally on climate, again, the solutions, if you look at the evolution from the UN framework framework convention on climate change, UN FCCC, you see that it's almost entirely state-based to start, and then it moves to the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement is one of the first international law, state-based agreements that actually has a place in that treaty, or treaty and agreement, for non-party stakeholders. So it's actually taking account of corporations and civic groups and individual activists and scientists. And then when you look at if you look at the COPs, what you see are strategies where, yes, you try to get states to keep ratcheting up their national contributions and to live up to what they say, but often you can't control the states. So you look to mayors, you look to governors, you look to corporations, you look to all the different groups who can make commitments where you have a chance of actually enforcing. All right, I want to make sure we have some time for questions, and we're running out of time. So let me quickly talk about if we've got all these problems, and they really are problems that are created by and focused on people and planet, and we've looked at how solutions are being framed as people and planet-centered solutions. That's great. There's lots of speeches. I can quote them all. I mean, I could write paper after paper just on this phenomenon. If I'm trying to teach a class in politics first and then law, if I'm teaching you international relations, I'm going to get to game theory before too long, and I'm going to give you a set of tools for how to turn competition or conflict into strategic competition, how to get to cooperation if you have common interests, or coordination, or at least avoid blowing up the world. So we've got those tools. What are the tools that can actually affect people and planet and governments? Again, still, governments are very important here. It's just that we're more in the domestic arena than we are the traditional international arena. And there are lots of those tools, but they are not collected anywhere. You're not going to find them in a casebook. And I've been collecting them, and I'm not going to go through examples, but I'll just give you the names. So some of them, this will not surprise those of you who know my work, are networks. My book on the chessboard and the web said, look, strategic connection is critical. We need to figure out whom to connect and how. I'll give you one example. For both pandemics and for defense, so I actually wrote this after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, you need what we call mesh networks. So think about clinics. The worst thing you can have in a world of communicable disease is George Washington Hospital. It's a great hospital. I've been there. It's such a good hospital. You know this. Everybody comes to it, and that's disastrous because then everybody leaves and they've spread the virus. You need specific clinics that are quite far apart where you can send people who maybe have Ebola, who have COVID. You want small collections of people. You want to be able to care for people. This is not house by house, but you want to keep them far away from the big medical centers. That's equally true, of course, as a defense strategy. You don't want to put all your ammunition and all your soldiers in a couple of big bases. You want to distribute them. It's a part of network theory. We could look at cooperation networks, resilience networks, innovation networks, but it is a way to connect all these actors strategically. The next thing that you can do, in addition to networks, is you can create impact hubs. And here I'll also use a health example. The Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which now just goes by Gavi, which has vaccinated almost over 600 million children, is composed of the WHO, a number of governments, the Gates Foundation, some other foundations, lots of pharmaceutical companies, because you need that for the vaccines, and NGOs who are on the ground to get to the last mile. What is key is it has a very clear mission. It's a measurable mission. It says this is how many children we're going to vaccinate. If it achieves its mission, it gets more funding, and then it can do more. And in theory, it is time limited. Now, since children keep getting born, for any given generation of children. So it's focused, it's measurable, and it brings together specific partners. You can do that in all sorts of different areas. There are a bunch of different complexity tools we can talk about in the question period. They're tools to govern long problems. So you can think about ways to overcome uncertainty by building in foresight mechanisms, experimentalist government, and a lot of this is being done domestically as well, but you can adopt it globally. There are ways to represent future interests. If anybody read Ministry for the Future, that is exactly an example of what New Zealand and Finland already have. They have committees for the future so that our future generations are represented. And there are ways to overcome institutional lag through goal setting and triggers and lots of mechanisms, again, that we use in domestic law. So we have the problems, we have the solutions, we have a set of tools that we can bring together and look at case studies and and teach them and figure out how, in fact, people can deploy them and we can collect information about that. So that's politics for people and planet. No law. What about the law? In part, I think you really, just as you did have to, international relations was not a discipline until the 20th century, right? It really didn't exist. So you have to create the frameworks to study politics this way before you can pull together the law. But here's where I'm going to end, somewhat radically. When I was a law student, Morty Horowitz taught me tort law. And Westlaw and LexisNexis, I'm really dating myself, had just come out, or recently, it's been 5 years. And Morty Horowitz, who was a torts professor, said, we've always had these categories of law. We have contracts and crim and civil procedure, which I used to teach. And that's because, essentially, those were the categories somebody decided on, and they were the categories of those books. You remember looking them all up in the West books. But LexisNexis, you could search anything. And so I'll never forget, Morty said, you could have horse law or sports law, which now, yeah, of course we have sports law, but you didn't have sports law then. How are you going to have sports law? You'd have to look through every contract's case book for a case book that had a sport in it. But once you had LexisNexis, you could say, you could all cases with basketball, all cases with whatever sport. And I want to say something similar here. I honestly think going forward, we will still have international law. We'll have transnational law, and you can put whatever you want into it. You have private law, comparative law, all that good stuff. But I think increasingly, you will search and gather law according to how well it frames a particular set of problems. We already have that in environmental law, but I think we'll be doing it much more specifically. Like we'll have biodiversity law, and we will be then thinking about what can mayors do? What can governors do? What can nation states do? What is the law that's going to govern corporations or civic groups that are in this area? What is a planetary institution? So we have this law, and we'll pull it together, and it's got tremendous potential. It's law governing all these different tools I've been talking about. But I think the categories will arise in tandem with our being able to focus on politics that engages people and planet alongside the traditional law of nation states. And thank you very much. People are still awake.
That's wonderful. So we do have time for questions. I already see hands going up. Would you like to call on people? Want me to?
You call on people, otherwise I'll be picking favorites.
Well, just first of all, thank you so much. Your work is always so path-breaking and aimed at helping the world, and this is just the same. And really, thank you. So I have two kind of related questions. The first one is, there has been a renewed focus, particularly in the U.S. government, on this, peer-peer competition, right? And, you know, the national security strategy is sort of both and, peer-peer plus this
Yep.
people and planet-centered framing that you're talking about. Is there a danger that the peer-peer focus is crowding out the people and planet-centered focus that you're really calling on us to acknowledge and to see? So that's sort of the first thing. And then relatedly, as you know, the Biden administration has really done a lot of dividing the world up among autocracies and democracies and is focused on promoting democracy. Are democracies inherently better at people and the planet? I mean, certainly with respect to human rights, definitionally they are. But are democracies better at people and planet-centered strategies?
Great question. So the answer to your first question is unquestionably yes. I mean, they say it's equal. I am quite certain that if I were looking at the diaries of everybody in the National Security Council and most people in the State Department, it's 80-20 at best. I would guess it's 90-10, except for John Kerry and a few other people. But in part, that's because the urgent and important, and Ukraine is, and Gaza and Israel are urgent and important, crowds out the slower pace. I would say all these other problems are urgent and important, but unless you've got a pandemic right then or a climate disaster right then. So I think unquestionably that's true. But the other problem is I really think they don't have the tools, right? So you would hire a different group of people. If you really believe this, you would have, the State Department would look different and the National Security Council would look different. And you would have very high-level people who were versed in lots of different mechanisms, frameworks, and tools in the same way that Jake Sullivan has sort of learned the basic. You've got sanctions, you've got obviously conflict, you've got all sorts of diplomatic partnerships. You know, they have a toolbox and they use it. So part of what I'm trying to do is to go back to the basics and say, you know, if we're really going to have this, we've got to build, we've got to teach, we've got to train. On the second, I think yes, but I prefer to use open societies versus closed societies. Now, I'm the one, my first article was, you know, law among liberal states. I have written a lot on democracies, but I really came to believe, even when Biden was a candidate, that this was not the right way to divide the world, and we're losing a lot of countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia. So I prefer to say that countries that are more open to NGOs and to non-state actors of all different kinds are better at this because the networks are much denser and they're more willing to relinquish state power also at the subnational level. Like our mayors, right now, if I were graduating, I would go work as, you know, in the deputy mayor in LA or deputy mayor for international affairs in LA and New York as much as I'd go to the State Department.
Wes and then Paul.
So appreciate very much this framing of the tools and responses element here, but as that runs into the reality of having to do this in the job, how do you propose like breaking away? We look at efforts, a lot of these things would be preventative in nature, and yet as you said, Ukraine, Gaza, etc., like it's like 8-year-olds running around the soccer field. You go to where the ball is, not to where you can actually do preventative defense. So how do you break when Congress funds that way, when, you know, briefings are called that way, when you're, even within the State Department, when your principals are asking about what's showing up on the evening news, how do you change the culture to be more preventative, long-term, you know, the long problems,
Yep.
as opposed to the immediates?
So it's a hard question, but I think there are a couple things. One, I do think setting up institutions that are specifically charged with looking across generations is important. I think the declaration for future generations, if that comes out of the Summit for the Future, could play the same role as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights over time, because suddenly you're saying, look, we have to take account of people who are going to be living in a world with, you know, 0.3 degrees or whatever it is. I think you can also, I mean, look, if you can have a central bank that is insulated and the courts that are insulated, at least some, and not completely, obviously they respond, but you could also create a national, I wouldn't want to call it the National Development Council because it'll just be, but you can think about how to frame national security in terms of these different sets of problems. And you can imagine a national security advisor. You know, the State Department didn't used to have 2 deputies, and now it does. So I can imagine 2 national security advisors. The other thing that you have to do is I would start with Treasury. I'd start actually with the Pentagon on climate change because they've done a ton of thinking about this. But you need to pull together different intergovernment networks who will then work with different groups. The State Department now, for the first time, does have an ambassador looking for state and local government or subnational government. I do a lot of that. So I think, and certainly for Congress, I'd lard that funding into, you know, the NDC, or they don't, not particular, or even DHS in some places. So I'd find other ways where people are networked with their global counterparts and think about it that way. And then you have to do that with other governments as well at the same time.
Paul, and then Barack.
Yeah, and you mentioned Ministry of the Future
Yep.
and so forth. I mean, you could imagine entities within government like ORERA where you sort of vet new policies,
Exactly.
new agency regulations, new statutes against the future.
Yep.
So you can imagine that. I was thinking also of, you mentioned sort of environmental stuff briefly, but you know, one of your distributed networks is, of course, courts all over the world, and we're seeing the beginning of kind of intergenerational climate change lawsuits,
Yep.
both against corporations and against states. And so that's another place where I sort of see what you're talking about kind of taking shape. So I just wanted to add that. And then the other thing that I wanted to add as one of your categories, and again, you mentioned it briefly, but you don't have it as one of your 3 categories, and I think I would add a 4th, is you gotta deal with migration.
Yes.
Because it's actually, you could map and predict where in the world people are not going to be able to live, and therefore where they're going to need to go. And that's going to be a core geopolitical and people-centered, planet-centered thing. And it seems to me it's got to be one of your 4 categories.
Yeah, no, I was using those categories just to illustrate. There are many, but I totally agree with you. And migration is the perfect intersection, right? We are totally people-centered, and yet, obviously, it's state borders. So those 2 systems are
clamping down.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, Bangladesh is going to be underwater. You can't, you know.
Barack.
So I teach sports law.
Ah, great.
I teach health law. If I know anything about horses, I teach sports law. But one thing I don't teach is international law. So maybe there's a definition. Maybe this is just simply a definitional question. But as a matter of policy, it makes enormous sense to rewire the institutions to create new coalitions and new networks. But law, at least as I understand it, is still enforced by the sovereign. It's still hardwired as in that non-web, in that old world map. So, and again, you know, maybe this is a different conception of law, but I would think that to use courts, as Paul is describing, would be really hard to pull out of the old paradigm to pursue something new, unless you have a different definition of law.
No, well, so international law does in the sense that there is no, global enforcement. So we have the International Court of Justice. There's no army. There's no federal marshals. So we always deal with what Tom Frank used to call the existential problem, where non-international lawyers say, how could this be law? It can't be enforced. And many of us, and I certainly include myself, spend a lot of time figuring out how to get international law questions into domestic court so that you have something that can enforce it. And you can remember war criminals, and remember when the Belgian court was going to go after Henry Kissinger and the State Department had a heart attack. So we understand that, and I would say international tribunals have they do now have jurisdiction in lots of ways. You have an international criminal court that does try war criminals and does actually put them in jail. So you've made progress. Also, Law of the Sea, a number of other tribunals. But actually, I come at it differently, which is I find these areas of law, as I'm imagining them, more fertile. So there are two dimensions. One, as I tell my students, all of you can be diplomats in this world, right? All of you can basically play the kind of foreign role that once was limited to governments. And they know that. They know they can go to NGOs already. They know they can go to corporations. But they don't have a framework for that. They have private law and private transnational corporate law. But now, so there are many more players who have agency. I mean, if you're the Gates Foundation, you have more power than many, many, many states, or not to mention big corporations. They have agency. They also have resources to be part of the solution. So we want them engaged because we can't solve these problems without them. But as a lawyer, you can use international institutions. But you've also, I didn't go through all the tools, but you can use the mechanisms of many domestic governments or regional, right? So you can go through EU law, which can be enforced. You can go through any national law, or you might be able to use treaties that are enforceable in domestic law. So there are multiple ways to actually take traditional international law, which isn't enforceable directly, and use it in ways that then will give on to enforceable mechanisms.
Universal jurisdiction using international NGOs to provide, indictment support.
Exactly.
Sierra.
First of all, thank you so much for the incredibly insightful lecture. I recently came across your article on whether Israelis and Palestinians inhabit the same world, which introduced a very interesting idea on how two populations that live so close and share so many things, seem to be completely disconnected and have different perceptions on what's going on and on so many issues. This got me thinking about what's the situation globally. So in the world that we live in, which is highly globalized, and naturally there's more opportunities than ever to, I guess, see things the same way and to come together. Is that really the case, or are we drifting apart more than ever? And then my second question is, if that is the case, me as a student of international law and speaking for everyone else here that studies international law, what could we do apart from studying it in order to change that?
Oh, okay, so this is that.
I want to hear you.
That was a great question. So I wrote a column for Project Syndicate, having read Ed Yong's book, An Immense World, which I totally recommend. It's an extraordinary book. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it, in which he basically describes the ways that living beings, animals, insects, things underwater, all the categories, have different senses. So, if a dog walks into this room, the dog is going to experience a world of smells that does not exist for us. I mean, it truly does not exist. We don't have the means of perceiving it. The dog will see this room in terms of 2 colors, and we'll see it in terms of 3 colors. And if you're fortunate enough to be a bird or many others, you'll see multiple other colors. So you'll see ultraviolet. And again, the concept is Umwelt, the German idea of this is your world. And what comes through so powerfully, it's a deeply pluralist book, is there are all these worlds existing. I mean, it's a little like parallel universes that are genuinely separate because I don't have access to what a dog experiences. I often think I don't have access to what my husband experiences, but in theory, we can bridge that gap. So I did say that I thought in some contexts, given the news they read, the life experience they've had, the separation, the deep separation physically in every other way, that one way of understanding what is happening in Israel and Gaza is that they honestly do not have the ability to see the world. We're constantly like, why can't you understand that, killing children in Gaza is like the Holocaust, but it's like October 7th. And the answer is, if you don't have that perception, it's been blocked out, then maybe we're asking too much. So I think that's a starting point, and I think it might help us understand, and here too, right? If you only watch Fox News, or you only watch CNN or MSNBC, you really are inhabiting, your sense of what's out there is very different. This, I think, is deeper. I still do believe we do have the same senses. And so that may be true for some generations, but if you're looking across, then you need to recreate a world in which people are experiencing enough of the same world to be able to build that bridge. That is not a solution for what is happening, but I thought it was a helpful framework. I think, though, to your second question, I still believe strongly that the world with international law and the world with the rule-based order is still a safer and better world than without it. I mean, if I'm half Belgian, Belgium was overrun routinely through the 19th century and the 20th century, and it didn't even violate a norm. I mean, so when Russia violates Ukraine, there is a global outcry. I believe that matters, and I believe you need to study it. What I am now saying is that's one framework, and it's going to be mixed with these other frameworks, and you've got many more tools and more possible approaches to try to solve a specific set of problems.
Thank you so much for being here and for all that you're saying and sharing. I work in the women's rights arena, a more specific part of it, but I work very in depth with people all over the globe on the issues I work on, primarily domestic violence and how courts do and don't deal with it. And the Europeans have the benefit of the European Court of Human Rights, they have the benefit of CEDAW, they have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We can't benefit from any of that here.
Yeah.
So I wonder, given that you're so embedded in US policy establishment and policy making, what do you think about, is the US a primary obstacle to developing what you're proposing? Because the US hasn't even been willing to sign on to these treaties that are even within a more traditional international law framework. It's hard for me to see how the US is going to advance what you're describing when they're already so retrograde in that realm. So I'm curious your thoughts about that.
That's interesting. Well, the first way, I mean, look, it's not accidental that Philip Jessup and American lawyers came up with transnational law, right? Americans were more flexible as lawyers compared to European lawyers, right? We are problem solvers. And so the Europeans would say, oh, the Americans will have no problem. They'll just do the runaround, right? They will start working on, and I should have mentioned that, people-centered security specifically looks at violence against women, and that is, as you and I well know, a bellwether for violence in the society generally, and looks at, it actually, one of the sources I read, dismantling the patriarchy in these conflict zones, and that's not how I would frame it, but I would say safety for women is going to be a big part of building that platform for more peaceful relations. I think the U.S. will do it under different labels, but I also think, and this is just the rise of the EU and the rise of the EU as the great regulatory power of the world, I think the U.S. is going to get pushed into signing a number of those things. You already see it with the law of the sea, which we already basically acknowledge. We just acknowledge it as customary law because how are we going to engage the EU? How are we going to compete with them when we don't even, we're not in that same umvelt to go back. So I actually, we're not going to sign it because Russia and China signed it or other countries who we consider our adversaries, but it's going to be, we're not going to like the EU leading the rule-based order. Or when I say we, that's some administrations. There are other administrations who might celebrate that.
So we're just about out of
I have a
time
question.
for questions, but we've got one over here.
Yes.
I would like to ask you, in retrospect, what do you feel was the most successful administration overall in the last few decades? Going back to the Carter administration, and on up, what do you feel actually made things work better as opposed to what we're seeing within the last year or so?
Oh, gosh. Oof. So I don't think there's any one. I can immediately think, so when you say Carter, I think, look, he embraced international human rights, to your point, and he was ridiculed for it, absolutely ridiculed. And I can't remember the woman who he appointed. Her name was Pat Darian. I knew it was Pat. I just couldn't come in. But that's hugely consequential, and it's been consequential for our domestic civil rights as well. And we always claimed that, of course, this wasn't human rights. This was just ours. So that's enormously important. He had the advantage of being president when there was détente, and he did a lot of good there. On the other hand, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the Iranian Revolution and the hostages happened. And I could go through. Reagan's walk in the woods and his commitment to real disarmament was also very important. And I think he and George H.W. Bush handled the end of the Cold War quite well. Clinton was very good, I think, on, he was good on the WTO. I would not rank him. I mean, I think Rwanda, anyway, I'm not going to go through each one. I would say that I think Obama had the best frame for how the U.S. actually has to lead going forward, which was much more not a superpower, not handing down what the rest of the world should do, but very much a partner, very much going through the multilateral institutions. And ultimately, even though I disagreed and still violently disagree with him on Syria, I think he should have bombed Assad's airport to stop the planes from dropping barrel bombs and chemical weapons. I do think he had the best overall concept of how we need to be in the world to address a lot of these questions. But he wasn't able to implement it, but he laid it. And actually, Biden is not following that. Biden is much more a 1990s president than an Obama president.
So just in closing, are you optimistic about November, given the choices that we're working with?
I will not let myself be complacent or even optimistic. I would prefer to worry and to motivate me, my organization, everybody I can to let's not take anything for granted.
So I think we should bring this to a close, but let me just say how much I enjoyed your remarks, Anne-Marie, and coming at it from that international law perspective, I totally see this idea that up until maybe 1945, it's a state-state construct that we're using, and that after the Second World War, we have this breakthrough in the field of human rights, and suddenly the human becomes a feature, and then we have this terrible environmental problems in the 60s and 70s, and suddenly we break through with international environmental law. That's the planet side of things.
Exactly.
And what you're really talking about is sort of the next generation of taking these things in a more granular way, tackling them. So to me, it made a huge amount of sense. So
real
thank
compliment.
You so much. Please join me in
thank you. Thank you. And of course, it forced me to. Nothing better than having to give a lecture to force yourself to think through it. Let's see. All right. So where's the?
So yeah, I should have said drinks back there and food over here.
Oh, yeah.
I should have mentioned there's drinks in the back and there's food over here for folks who are hungry.
Well, very much so. Have learned, enough of the bureaucracy to be dangerous now. Have learned enough to properly get myself in trouble. But I greatly enjoy the fact that my job is to focus I am privileged in the sense of I don't have to I get to be an advocate for atrocity prevention. That's my job. I walk into a room and all I am supposed to do is make that argument. That's incredible. And one of my colleagues said, look, we recognize that this issue will never be the primary decision-making issue, but our job is to make sure it's one of the things you think about. Yes, and that's something I need to do. Just waiting for my TS level to go through. Once that happens, I'll transition. 6 months almost now.
Sarah, hi, are you? Okay, nice to meet you.
Well, SCI. Yeah, that actually, like, for my job, like, we actually are lucky had prior precedent that this role that one. Oh, you mean from the time?
Yeah, right down.
Yeah,
I'll be there. I expect I'll be there.
All right, I'm gonna take off. It's good to see you. Great to see you again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pleasure to listen to this one. I was interested. I was really.
What has law had a law firm in Paris? In Paris, with the Russian office. With the Russian office. I mean, I didn't know. I remember that about
And I would
I'm glad you feel it.
Actually, just about, GW was so nice to me to keep me on the road.
Right.
Actually use it.
Why not? Yeah. Yeah. Did you know Anne Marie
Resolution.
Oh yeah, right.
And
Yeah.
I got a response.
It sounded like it might not even get adopted.
It gets through the executive committee without changes. So I don't know what the procedure.
Were there no changes?
Well, I have no idea whether there were, but it certainly didn't. When I read it, it didn't seem coherent.
I'd have to go back and look at it.
I did look at those because they said link to the Constitution part of right. Questions.
So that's,
So what we need, so it's probably going to be an issue in the executive.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But since
Right. Which I have to miss.
it's hard to recognize.
Well, it gets through.
Oh, right, absolutely.
Right.
Wow.
Mike made it sound like it was gonna be.
That's one thing.
But you,
I mean,
you should look at whether it makes sense in what it says about it.
Yeah. No, I gave Michael comment, not Michael, I gave Brad comments,
sorry, you were.
which were similar to the